of slavery, in 1865, advocates for African American equality understood that racially restrictive sex and marriage laws and the state-enforced regime of racial identification that those laws made possible lay at the heart of the segregated system they struggled to overthrow. In 1905, the sociologist, journalist, and activist W.E.B. Du Bois wrote the right to associate with those who wish to associate with me into the pledge of the Niagara Movement, the predecessor to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. After the NAACP was formed in 1909, its first national lobbying victory was to convince Congress not to pass a racially restrictive marriage law for the District of Columbia. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Communist Party of the United States and communist-affiliated organizations called for complete social equality and the repeal of state anti-miscegenation laws. During and immediately after World War II, Christian interracial associations like the Federal Council of Churches joined secular radicals in this call. In the 1950s and 1960s, new organizations such as the Southern Christian Leadership Council, SCLC, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, also embraced this position on sex and marriage, even as they focused primarily on issues of education, voting, and housing. Given the centrality of racially restrictive sex and marriage laws to the creation and maintenance of white supremacy, one would expect their reversal to have been a top priority for advocates of African American equality. But for all the advocacy and lobbying against these laws, there was never a mass movement to overturn them. When the Supreme Court finally ruled in Loving v. Virginia that laws forbidding Americans to marry across the color line violated the 14th Amendment, the case was argued by representatives of the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, not the NAACP. For more than a century between emancipation and 1967, African American rights were closely bound, both in law and in the white imagination, to the question of interracial sex and marriage. At every stage of the struggle for civil rights, sex played a central role, even when its significance was left unspoken. Overcoming the conflation of sexual and civil rights was a project of decades, and arguably the greatest challenge champions of Black equality faced. Interracial marriage was regulated in America for more than 300 years. In the beginning, in the colonies of Maryland and Virginia, freeborn English men and women were permitted to marry Africans and the indigenous people Europeans called Indians. But laws governing interracial sex and marriage emerged only a few years after the first contact between Africans and Europeans in America, and played an essential role in establishing stable categories of blackness and whiteness, and therefore stable categories of slave and free. The sexual activity of white men with black women, mainly between masters and slaves, produced most of the mixed-race population in the South. The majority of these encounters were almost certainly coerced, either through force or through more subtle invocations of the vast disparity of power between the partners. The children born of such unions were enslaved, as their legal status followed that of their mother. As time went on, liaisons between white women and colored men, tolerated as recently as the 17th century, presented a social dilemma insofar as the mixed-race children of white women were free and undermined efforts to link freedom and racial identity. In an attempt to solder status to race once and for all, Southern states passed new laws in the 18th century that prohibited marriage between whites and blacks and also punished people who engaged in interracial adultery. The first legal ban on interracial marriage was a 1705 Virginia Act, which also defined who was non-white. These laws did not mean that white and black Americans stopped having sex with each other. Although white men crossed the racial boundary,